Good evening, and welcome back to the Psychedelic Cafe. Tonight is part 4 of my series, When Heidegger Met Castaneda. And tonight we are going to take a tour from Greece to Mexico via Germany. So hang on to your hats. Heidegger starts being in time out with a discussion about the Greeks. He felt that the fundamental stance of our outlook and specific errors in our thinking began with the Greeks. At this most basic level, Plato has us still seeking universal or ideal truths, and Aristotle has us seeking essences, as if an essence could be distilled from the human being or Dasein. This discussion has a couple of aspects. One is to set the stage for his discourse on being, such that the distinctions that Heidegger draws gain clarity and stand out. The second aspect is to sensitize us, the readers, as to how we carry the past inside of us. He wants us to see that it is not just an intellectual or philosophical exercise. It is also a matter of feeling. He wants us to get in touch with how we really still do see the world through the eyes of the Greeks. Heidegger will make a lot more sense when you can feel what it is he's talking about. But let's get started. Heidegger says that the reason why an inquiry into being is generally held to be unnecessary or even methodologically unsound is because of long-held basic presuppositions regarding the nature of being itself. And the first presupposition is that being is the most universal concept. It is the concept of concepts. This is very Platonic. The second presupposition is derived from the first, in the sense that if one defines the most universal concept as something particular, then it is no longer the most universal. It cannot be understood as a particular entity or having a particular characteristic without violating its own definition. It's like the omni understanding of God. And the third one is that being has always been held as self-evident. So I'm going to read from page 23 of Being in Time. And he said, "It is held that being is of all concepts the one that is self-evident. Whenever one cognizes anything or makes an assertion, whenever one comports oneself towards entities, even towards oneself, some use is made of being. And this expression is held to be intelligible without further ado. Just as everyone understands, the sky is blue, I am merry, and the like. But here we have an average kind of intelligibility which merely demonstrates that this is unintelligible. It makes manifest that in any way of comporting oneself towards entities as entities, even in any being towards entities as entities, there lies a priori an enigma. The very fact that we already live in an understanding of being, and that the meaning of being is still veiled in darkness, proves that it is necessary in principle to raise the question again. Inquiry, as a kind of seeking, must be guided beforehand by what is sought. So the meaning of being must already be available to us in some way. As we have intimated, we always conduct our activities in an understanding of being. Out of this understanding arise both the explicit question of the meaning of being and the tendency that leads us towards its conception. We do not know what being means. But even as we ask, what is being, we keep within an understanding of the is, though we are unable to fix conceptually what that is signifies. We do not even know the horizon in terms of which that meaning is to be grasped and fixed. But this vague understanding of being is still a fact. Further, this vague average understanding of being may be so infiltrated with traditional theories and opinions about being that these remain hidden as sources of the way in which it is prevalently understood. What we seek when we inquire into being is not something entirely unfamiliar, even if at first we cannot grasp it at all. So let's sum up this section by understanding it as a major theme in Heidegger. And it is that we all have a folk understanding of being, right or wrong, and that this folk understanding is one we have had since the Greeks. Heidegger calls this the pre-ontological understanding of being. And the word there is pre-ontological. You'll run into that a lot in Heidegger. Ontology is a solid Greek word composed of ontos, which means being, and ology, which means the study of. So ontology at the most basic level is the study of being. Heidegger says that this folk understanding is the understanding of being that is held by what he formally terms das Mann, which in German means the they. This folk understanding is what really defines das Mann. And this is the common outlook one has automatically as a member of a culture. I say it is something we absorb by osmosis even as infants, long before we have any chance to understand it or have an I-thou relationship to it. We wake up in a culture, and it simply is the way it is for us. And this is why Heidegger says that we all have a pre-ontological understanding of culture. We live it and breathe it without ever gaining a formal understanding of it. Like everyone else, we just do it. Let's turn our attention now to Castaneda and what Juan calls the tonal, Tonal, the tonal. It's a fundamentally important idea in Castaneda. So what is the tonal? First, it is a feature of the human being, and it corresponds closely to Heidegger's Dasein. So I'm going to read from Tales of Power, starting at page 119, where Juan first introduces Carlos to the idea of the tonal. "This is my tonal," Don Juan said, rubbing his hands on his chest. Carlos asks, "Your suit?" "No, my person." He pounded his chest and his thighs and the side of his ribs. "My tonal is all of this." He smiled and winked at me. "I'm using your own words now," he said. "The tonal is the social person." He laughed, I suppose, at the sight of my bewilderment. The tonal is, rightfully so, a protector, a guardian that most of the time turns into a guard. I fumbled with my notebook. I was trying to pay attention to what he was saying. He laughed and mimicked my nervous movements. "The tonal is the organizer of the world," he proceeded. "Perhaps the best way of describing its monumental work is to say that on its shoulders rests the task of setting the chaos of the world in order. It is not far-fetched to maintain, as sorcerers do, that everything we know and do as men is the work of the tonal. At this moment, for instance, what is engaged in trying to make sense out of our conversation is your tonal. Without it, there would only be weird sounds and grimaces, and you wouldn't understand a thing of what I'm saying. I would say then that the tonal is a guardian that protects something priceless, our very being. Therefore, an inherent quality of the tonal is to be cagey and jealous of its doings. And since its doings are by far the most important part of our lives, it is no wonder that it eventually changes in every one of us from a guardian into a guard. He stopped and asked me if I had understood. I automatically nodded my head affirmatively, and he smiled with an air of incredulity. A guardian is broad-minded and understanding, he explained. A guard, on the other hand, is a vigilante, narrow-minded and most of the time despotic. I say then that the tonal in all of us has been made into a petty and despotic guard, when it should be a broad-minded guardian. And Juan goes on a little later to say, the tonal is everything we are, he proceeded. Name it. Anything we have a word for is the tonal. And since the tonal is its own doings, then everything obviously has to fall under its domain. The tonal is everything we know, he repeated slowly. and that includes not only us as persons, but everything in our world. It can be said that the tonal is everything that meets the eye, everything that meets the eye. So now we've been introduced to the tonal by Don Juan. Let's return to Heidegger and weave this back together. Heidegger says many times in Being and Time that what is ontically closest to us is ontologically furthest away. The word ontic is an adjective that relates to the real character of things or entities, and Heidegger uses it to point to the particulars and characteristics of everyday being. Everyday being. So what he means here is that we all encounter the particulars of being in everyday life without ever understanding being in an ontological sense. In those terms, the tonal is ontically closest to us, and yet is ontologically furthest away. We all live in our tonal without any awareness of its doings. And this is what Juan is pointing to when he says that the tonal is very cagey and jealous of its doings. He also says that it is very shy. An important point here is where Juan says that in most of us, the tonal becomes a pedantic guard instead of a broad-minded guardian. This is exactly what Heidegger is describing in Das Man, the they. Heidegger says that we are born as an open-minded Dasein, but as he puts it many times, proximally and for the most part, our Dasein is given over to Das Man. We see what Das Man sees, we feel what Das Man feels, and we believe what Das Man believes. And rarely do we live authentically. Heidegger does not like Das Man very much, and he lets us know this. Be warned. Now here's the last section of what Juan tells Carlos about the tonal. Poor Carlos again is in a quandary here. I still cannot understand, Don Juan, what you mean by the statement that the tonal is everything, I said after a moment's pause. The tonal is what makes the world. Is the tonal the creator of the world? Don Juan scratched his temples. The tonal makes the world only in a manner of speaking. It cannot create or change anything, and yet it makes the world because its function is to judge, assess, and witness. I say that the tonal makes the world because it witnesses and assesses it according to tonal rules. In a very strange manner, the tonal is a creator that doesn't create a thing. In other words, the tonal makes up the rules by which it apprehends the world. So in a manner of speaking, it creates the world. I describe the tonal as a field of intelligibility. I quoted Heidegger earlier where he says that we live in an average kind of intelligibility. And remember what Heidegger said, there lies a priori an enigma, the very fact that we already live in an understanding of being. Heidegger is pointing to the mystery of the tonal. Heidegger has a word for it, and he terms it worlding. Worlding is an inherent feature of Dasein. Dasein does worlding. It's actually a verb. What Heidegger means is that we automatically find ourselves in a complete world, and it's not something that we learn piece by piece. It's an inherent feature of every Dasein or human being. This is what Juan is pointing to when he says, the tonal is the organizer of the world. Much more will be said about this. I'm just laying down structural pieces here. I want to put this piece in, however. I've been reading Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy, and Russell is certainly the epitome of an analytic, mathematical philosopher. And more than once, when introducing the next philosopher in this history, he'll say something like, well, let's take a look at their system and its axioms. He's expecting that any form of worthwhile philosophy will be axiomatic. It will be a top-down understanding from some basic assumptions and then deducing a system. And Heidegger is not this kind of philosopher at all. His work is descriptive, and he's very careful to keep his work descriptive. It is not a formal deductive system generated from axioms and high-level propositions. And he's not taking the role of a master standing above you and telling you what is what, that you accept his system or you don't. Heidegger is attempting to describe what it is actually like to encounter the world. In that sense, you stand shoulder to shoulder with him and are free to compare your description with his. This is true for Don Juan also. I hope I can get people curious about this subject. When I started reading Heidegger, it was a forehead-slapping experience. It was like, this is Castaneda in English. So if I can get some of you to see what I'm seeing and get you to slap your foreheads, that would be wonderful. This is a discourse, and I am a student of this discourse. So thank you all, and stay tuned for the next issue of this series on the Psychedelic Cafe. Good night.